Thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be here today to talk to you about neuroscience. I feel like it's a little bit different than what you've heard about during this conference, but it fits really well in the realm of qual research just because we go about it in the same way that one-on-one kind of connection, relationship, and amount of information that you get from somebody from speaking to them face-to-face. So a little bit about true impact. We believe that there is a great deal of information that people are not telling you about your products. And we know that if we look a little bit deeper, we can get to that subconscious emotional response that people have towards maybe a brand or a message coming from a brand. So my personal background is in neuroscience, and I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to take what we know from science over the last century, all we know about the human brain from psychology and neuroscience, and just bring it into the boardroom and be able to make decisions based on that? And so this is how True Impact was launched 4 years ago. We're based out of Toronto, Canada. We do a lot of work in North America, but we basically focus on humanizing the reader, getting at the information that you otherwise would not know by simply asking. So we believe that in order to get the big picture, you need to have a combination of both explicit responses from a particular participant, as well as implicit responses, gut feeling reactions they have, liking, disliking, paying attention, and so on. So I'm going to give you a number of case studies and a bit of a primer on what this consumer neuroscience field is. And feel free to ask any questions as we go. Now, some of the challenges that I've experienced. Now, I've worked in marketing for about a decade after finishing my neuroscience degree. I would be on the other side of the glass. Let's say my most recent capacity was a marketing director with Bell Canada, and I would want to understand how people feel about telecommunications services in Canada. It was really interesting to see how some people may want to alter their responses to say what they think we wanted to hear, and I always felt there was something missing. And I knew from science that there is a lot going on at that gut feeling level. So this is how True Impact launched. We knew so much about who's buying and what they're buying, but we didn't really understand why people do what they do. Now, this is one of my favorite quotes. If I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And sometimes people don't know what they want. You have to show your customers what they're going to be passionate about and interested in next year or 3 years from now. And it all starts with understanding their core emotions. What is their gut feeling towards an idea? Now, this is the only slide of the brain, I promise you, but I felt it was important to demonstrate just how we actually work at a biological level. When you receive information from the world, from all 5 senses, it comes through the core of the brain and moves outwardly towards the neocortex. So we know that it is impossible to speak to somebody at that higher level thinking, the neocortex being the new part of the brain, most recently developed in evolution. You can't possibly talk to somebody about facts and figures and gigabytes and speeds without first establishing trust, right? And we buy based on trust. We buy based on familiarity. And these are all emotions. So the key input into logic, before you actually are able to convert a customer to select you, to download something, or to buy your product, you need to first establish an emotional relationship, which is the first level before you can actually communicate something logical. Now, what are some of the emotional triggers that we look for when we run neuroscience research? We look for motion, for example. Is there anything interesting going on that will draw the eye to that product? We look to see how can you explain an old idea in a new way, and how can you entice the brain into, let's say, adopting an idea with some novel way of presenting it. And ultimately, there's also something that really works, which is called dissonance. And this has to do with mismatching of ideas, something that makes you basically do like a double take, let's say. Now, I don't think that's a Heineken hat, but I thought that was pretty funny. So I'm here to tell you about the sense of touch. I'm passionate about how our brain works, how our mind works. If you're going to have a connection with somebody, it has to be based on trust. But when you first establish that first point of interaction with a customer, you can do so by engaging multiple senses. We typically engage the maybe visual sense if it's a digital format, but engaging the physical sense has a big imprint on the brain and making a positive experience of your brand. And why is that? We have a huge part of the brain dedicated specifically to just interpreting the world, the touch sense. So much so that if we were to take that particular part of the cortex and just map it out, you can actually see how much real estate is dedicated to getting physical, input and also moving certain parts of your body. That if we were, you notice how big the hands are, right? Because it's very important for us to utilize our hands in everyday life. So our brain is designed like this. This matters because the way you communicate with your customer is all based on our biology, and they will perceive the senses based on how much real estate we have allocated to them in the brain. Now, what I like actually about this distribution is if you were to map out a person according to our brain structure, we wouldn't really look human. We would look something like this. Because these are the areas that are most represented in our mind. Right now, we took some R-rated parts out, but you can imagine those are very important as well. So we see the world through our hands. We experience the world through our taste, through our sense of taste and sight as well. Very important. So when it comes to touch systems, there's quite a few. They have 3 touch systems. This is kind of like being in class, but this is really interesting stuff as well. You have a different sense of touch for identifying movement in objects, right? A different sense of touch for a hug or a social interaction. It's a totally different network of sensors in your brain. And then a totally different network for identifying pain and also being bothered by it, right? Well, some people are more or less bothered by it. It is really, really important to understand that when you're making an impression in the mind of your customer, it is a multi-sensory impression. And the sense of touch is really important because we are first interacting with the world through the sense, right? Even as babies, as we learn to interact with the world. Now, why does this matter in your product evaluation? This is an interesting example. People who are given water in, let's say, a flimsy paper cup versus a more firm bottle. I didn't want to put Fiji up there, but you can imagine many brands of water that are packaged in very firm plastic. They assign better qualities to the water than when given the same water in a flimsy paper cup, right? It is the reason why we like to package, let's say, macaroons, right? The little desserts in nice thick cardboard boxes, and it creates a whole experience. Now you're thinking, okay, this brand put some time into this, right? And they value it more. And we see this reaction across age groups. We see this for millennials, Gen X, as well as boomers, that our brain is just simply wired to engage with tactile senses that feel good to us. So obviously, if you're promoting a product or you're trying to understand how to communicate the value of a product that is perhaps once a year, once every 4 years expense, you want to make sure that the touch experience that people have with that product is reflective of that it feels rich, so to speak, right? If it's a higher investment. If it's a lower investment, we found that when you're looking to promote, let's say, you're doing a flyer, let's say, and you're promoting a sale this weekend, it's better to use a thinner stock to convey the fact that this is a discount. This is a low investment item, right? Again, subconscious assumptions and biases that we have towards the world around us. Now, neuroscience tools come in many shapes and sizes, but I'm going to simplify them down to 2 buckets. There's neuroscience devices, which basically measure the brain, and then biometrics, which measure everything from the brain down, the body. Neuroscience tools include fMRI. If you've ever had an MRI, a functional magnetic resonance imaging is basically measuring blood flow in the brain. It allows us, more specifically our research team, to identify what emotions are experienced in relationship to your brand. So if you are Volvo and you want to know if you mean safety in the mind of your customer, there's a neural pathway for that specific emotion that can be identified using an fMRI. If you are Coca-Cola and you want to know if you mean happiness in the mind of your customer, you would want to use something like that. The fMRI is like the Cadillac of brain research. Another device that we are able to use nowadays is something called electroencephalogram, or EEG. EEG was actually invented in 1924. So it took only 100 years for us to actually apply it to the way we market and to business. But EEG measures electrical activity at the surface of the brain, which basically means you're able to identify if somebody likes or dislikes what they're looking at. You can see if somebody's paying attention or if they're spacing out. You can see if somebody's perhaps not able to understand your message. And these are very important metrics in determining if somebody's familiar with the brand, right? A new item, a novel item that is presented to a person will require more effort for the brain to decode. But a familiar item, you see it, you get it, it's automatic, right? So when we go shopping, we buy what we bought before, 87% of the time. Because familiarity is easy on the brain. So we're able to see exactly what is that gut feeling response that a person has when they first interact with an experience, a product, an in-store environment, a digital environment, whatever it may be. And so just another quick summary. There's brain metrics and biometrics, measuring everything from... Now, the interesting point about this, we found that when we only use biometrics, like eye tracking, for example, we get a chance to understand where people are looking, which is useful to know, but you don't really know if they're having a positive experience or not, right? So you can look at a photo of a train wreck for a very long time, but it doesn't mean you're emotionally engaged with it. You could be disgusted by it. You could look at something for a long time because you don't understand it, right? So same thing with heart rate. You know, when you measure heart rate, you know that there is a response. Heart rate goes up, but you don't really know why, right? Is it because they were interested? We don't know. Is it because they were startled or confused or disgusted? We have no idea, right? So biometrics are unidirectional. In order to add some dimension, in order to understand the full human experience, we need to understand the brain activity, because that will tell us when somebody's looking in a certain area, how they're feeling as well, right? So we're able to pair biometrics with neurometrics to really know where they look and how they feel, right? So that pairing, that marriage is very, very important. Now, when it comes to the senses of touch, print versus digital, we had a chance to work with Canada Post about a year ago, and we conducted the largest EEG study of its kind. We had 270 participants, 9 unique samples, and we looked at what is the brain difference between somebody who experiences physical media versus digital media. And over on the physical side, we broke it down even further. We looked at postcards, we looked at an envelope and a letter. We looked at a dimensional piece, so like a box that would open. And then on the digital side, we looked at smartphone, laptop, emails, and banner ads. A fantastic study. It speaks volumes about how people react to all these different channels. So I'm not going to tell you all the findings, but I'd be happy to share with you the full white paper. Today I want to give you just some top-level results. As I mentioned before, some of the brain metrics that we collected during the study included motivation, which has to do with frontal bilateral asymmetry. Basically, we can tell what you're drawn to. Do you want to approach something you're seeing, or do you want to avoid it, right? This happens in a fraction of a second. No human being can possibly verbalize this, right? And then if we ask people to tell us, well, what did you think? They're searching their memory to try to come up with an answer. But in the moment, if something draws you in or repels you, that is what a motivation metric will tell us. Something like cognitive load. Do we have a pointer? Here, sorry. Cognitive load tells us how difficult something is to understand, right? What is the amount of cognitive effort that somebody has to put in to make sense of what it is they're seeing? We don't want cognitive load to be too high, because as you saw yesterday, I took my System 1, System 2 slides out. But that's basically the principle that we run on. We are on autopilot most of the time, and we want things to be easy to understand and familiar. So cognitive load is a metric that in some instances we don't want it to be too high, right? But motivation is one that we do want to engage people on. Now, some other metrics from the EEG include something like arousal, which basically stands for emotional intensity. If you're showing somebody a horror movie, you want to make sure you get that emotional intensity peaks at certain moments in time, and you don't prolong a scene or a part, let's say if it's a commercial or a horror movie, you don't prolong a scene that will dull the experience. You want to engage people at certain points. So, and then visual attention coming from eye tracking as well. I want to show you a brief clip that describes how the study was conducted. I invite you to ask me for the full white paper, but today I'm only going to highlight a couple of top-level findings. The interesting thing about this study is that putting neuroscience or putting any form of objective brain and biometrics measurement at the core of a company, now in this case this is a government agency, actually was able to prompt a whole new aspect to their business. So now Canada Post offers something called smart mail marketing, which are marketing services to their clients, businesses in Canada, rooted in what they've learned about the brain and how the brain reacts to physical media, right? So it is a little nugget of wisdom that had a big impact in the overall organization. Now, what did we find? We found that physical media, when it comes to cognitive load, the amount of cognitive effort that somebody has to put in to understand a message coming in print is lower for physical. So here, the higher is not the better in this case. And why is that? Because on a digital screen, if it's an email, for example, that you're communicating with somebody, they have so many other tabs open. There's ads going, depending on what email provider you use. There's a lot of things going on digital. Digital actually requires the most amount of effort on the brain, right? But when you're holding a physical piece in your hand, there's nothing else going on but that experience. So your brain doesn't have to work as hard. And this is very helpful when you're trying to help somebody remember your brand. Because with a print piece, we had a much higher likelihood of somebody actually remembering the brand that we were promoting. These were made-up brands, so we wanted to eliminate the bias, right, that people have towards certain. And we used low involvement offers, we used high involvement offers, we wanted to understand the differences. Again, full results are in the report, but overall the brand recall was much higher when the information was presented in print. We found that print was actually more motivating, and this was very interesting because that combination of low cognitive load and high motivation is exactly what we wanted to see. It was much more persuasive to communicate a message in print because there was no distractions. There was just that one experience. And when we used eye tracking, we wanted to see, and it wasn't observational eye tracking. We actually defined areas of interest. Things like how often did they glance over the logo? How often did they glance over the image of perhaps the models representing the product? How often did they look at the product details? Did they look at their name? Because these pieces were also personalized. So we wanted to, and we mounted and we created heat maps for all these regions of interest, right? This is kind of what the process looked like. And we found that in digital, there's more visual attention being paid to these key areas of interest. Now, this goes back to my point. If you only use biometrics and you get this result, you think, wow, okay, they're looking at digital a lot more than they're looking at physical. But you don't know why. You don't know what's going on in their minds and in their hearts. So the best way to look is at the whole picture. Because remember, the motivation was higher and the cognitive effort was lower, right? So when somebody's looking at something for a long time, they may just be trying to make sense of it. They may just be working harder to decipher or to focus on the message and overall end up being less persuaded by the message. That was one of the key findings here. And some of the key, I guess, interesting aspects as to how we process the world around us. In this age of technology, we all think that, you know, we can multitask. We don't multitask. We just switch from one task to another. But definitely, when you're able to pick up a book to read, or when you're interacting with something physical, the footprint is much greater. So we learned that you have a stronger overall positive response, you have better recall, and overall you're more likely to drive action. What we're saying is not to do away with digital, we're saying to sequence print and digital, or physical media and digital media, in a way that is most engaging for your brand and your customer journey, right? And what is the right combination? It will depend from industry to industry. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you on that. Now, what happens in store? When it comes to store experience, we want to know where people are looking, right? First challenge that a marketer has is be seen, then be relevant, and then be contacted, right? How are you going to be seen? Well, we can use eye tracking in store, and we can design experiences where we will bring perhaps, you know, just changing the merchandising, very simple stuff. bringing one banner on this side and changing the location of things to ensure that we draw the eye to where we want it to be. It could be an outside of a store. It could be the inside of a store. What we see is that people are drawn to faces. Now, our brain is wired to look at faces. And faces are, this is an interesting lesson, a key takeaway perhaps. When you present the face of a model next to your product, people will look at the model's face. Why? Because we have a huge part of the brain, called the fusiform gyrus, dedicated specifically to interpreting faces. It's so important for us when we're born that we recognize our mom and we recognize our family. It is a matter of survival, right? So a face of a human being will take away attention from your product any day, unless you're able to make, in this case, the face of the person or baby look towards the product, which is an interesting trick that I see being used more and more, because all of a sudden now we don't have all the attention on the face, now we're looking towards the product and the content. So we wanted to understand when people are shopping in a store, when we know what draws their attention, faces, colors, contrast, elements like that, we wanted to see how do people shop for toothpaste. So we worked with Colgate to bring people into a demo store. And this is a facility that looks exactly like what in Canada we call a Shoppers Drug Mart, but it looks exactly like a convenience store or a place that you would shop. And specifically for toothpaste, we redesigned the whole planogram. We brought competitors on the same shelf. We pretty much mimicked exactly what they would go and see in a store. And we used eye tracking and EEG to see how people shop, how often they look at the competition, how often do they see the brand that we're trying to promote, and do they notice a difference between when we switch packages around, right? So we had unique samples of people look at 2 different packages. And so after putting the EEG and eye tracking on, we set them shopping. And this is what it looks like when we go and we measure brain activity. This is not a toothpaste style, but you can see the difference and how this information comes to us. We'll track how the brain reacts, we'll track where they're looking. A lot of our data actually looks like code, but this is just for visualization purposes. And we break it down frame by frame, and we want to notice where people are looking. Oh, I'm not sure why the second one's not playing. So we will see in real time where people's attention is going and also how their brain's behaving. Now what we saw is that with the current planogram, the current pack actually didn't really draw too much attention to it. We scanned it from an angle as well because that's how you would enter the aisle. Again, we try to mimic real life. We don't ask any question, we let just the person react. However, when we had a new pack design, we were able to see a big difference, specifically attention to areas of the package that would communicate what it actually does. So this was one of 8 different concepts that we tested, but this one performed really well. We said, let's take it to the lab, let's see how people feel about it. Motivation-wise, their brain was a lot more engaged with the new pack. We thought that was interesting. Let's look at how they actually react. What do they tell us in a survey? We saw that people said they preferred the 2 packs about equally, but the new pack is actually a lot more motivating. So the brain and the mouth will disagree, and we see this on a regular basis. Our neuroscience results then concluded that what people purchased was in line with exactly how they felt. So the second takeaway is that people will act on how they feel, not what they say, right? This is very important. If we're going to get the big picture on our customer, we really need to understand what people are saying, what people are feeling. So the top 3 insights for when it comes to designing a retail experience or in-store experience is, first of all, be aware that decision fatigue is real. When somebody's shopping for something at the end of the day, they had to make decisions their whole day as to their job and family and so on. They just need to get their item and get out. So how are you going to draw their attention when a person's in that frame of mind? Then how are you going to be perceived as relevant and ultimately be selected? These are the challenges that we help address. in the same sort of methodology that you would run a focus group, right? We would recruit from a representative sample and see how they behave towards that product. Second of all is sell to your tribe and not to everybody. There are specific shoppers for every specific product. Nowadays, you have enough products to please everybody. So you really want to understand who your shopper is and not start with kind of a broad range, well, you know, males from 18 to 54. And ultimately, visual attention is automatic and quick. And it is guided by what we bought before, by how much we trust the brand, everything but logical factors. You know, what draws our attention is beyond our control. We're drawn to faces, we're drawn to high contrast, loud, flashy things. I was in Vegas last week, and I can tell you it is overwhelming, the amount of stimuli coming at you, trying to grab your attention. But when you're in a store environment, when you're trying to communicate with someone digitally or online, their visual attention is completely automatic. So the key lesson is make sure you draw their attention to your key call to action, which the mind can only process one concept at a time, so it should be a single message. And ultimately, one that is going to be relevant to them in that moment and one that will end up persuading them. Now, I hope that after the examples you saw and some of the science behind it, I hope that it gets you thinking a little bit differently. That customers are beyond numbers and data, they're actual people, and we can humanize them with this sort of science now. And I invite you to think about how can your brand and how can your company create a message that will resonate and ultimately drive value in their life. Thank you.